Gun violence is on the rise in our country. You see it in the stats, and you see it in the headlines from towns like Parkland, Sandy Hook, and Uvalde.
Some lawmakers and activists have pushed for legislation that limits gun ownership, while others have tried to expand gun rights, both in the name of gun safety. These efforts have sparked a national debate on how to reduce gun violence.
In this segment, we're going to look at some legal and public policy approaches to reducing gun violence and seeing how legislators and activists are trying to balance citizens' rights with civic responsibilities.
Much of what's happening right now is happening at the state level. In the past few years, states like California, Delaware, and New York have passed laws to strengthen background checks and regulate untraceable firearms, known as ghost guns.
Ghost guns come in kits to be assembled at home, circumventing most laws that regulate firearm sales.
At the same time, states like Texas have passed laws to loosen gun regulations, making it legal for most adults to carry a handgun in a holster without a permit. Some believe that will deter crime and make for safer communities.
The first major national gun safety legislation in decades passed in June 2022. The law did not directly restrict firearm ownership, but it did include funding for school safety initiatives and state crisis intervention programs. But a lack of bipartisan agreement in Congress continues to be an obstacle for legislative efforts to reduce gun violence at the federal level, and laws that pass one year may be overturned by courts or by subsequent legislatures.
When we consider what policies would be effective in reducing gun violence, we have to consider the unique protections for gun ownership that we have in the United States, as well as the sheer number of guns in private ownership.
America's fundamental protection for firearm ownership is enshrined in the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
Any law passed by state or federal legislature is subject to review by the courts, where judges rule on whether or not the law is in conflict with the Constitution. Some of those cases end up in the hands of the 9 justices of the Supreme Court. And as those 9 justices change over time, so has the Supreme Court's interpretation of what the Second Amendment means.
Over the past couple decades, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutional right to self-defense with a firearm and ruled that restrictions on gun ownership are constitutional only if there is a tradition of such laws in U.S. history. And while the court has allowed for some limitations on gun ownership and where guns can be carried, most court watchers believe that legislation restricting gun ownership is unlikely to pass constitutional review at this time.
So with that in mind, what possible legal or legislative actions could be taken to reduce gun violence? Let's break down the pros and cons of 3 possible actions.
Our first proposal would take the existing background check system now required for sales by all licensed dealers and extend that system to all private sales and loans of firearms, creating one minimum standard across the United States.
Depending on the state you're in, current laws may allow for private parties to exchange firearms as gifts or sales without a background check.
Supporters believe extending background checks to private sales will reduce gun violence by stopping prohibited purchasers from buying firearms in this way. They say checks are easy to run, usually process quickly, and are accurate. They also cite the policy's popularity. According to some polls, more than 90% of Americans support universal background checks, and some research suggests universal background checks may even hinder illegal gun trafficking.
But others say laws requiring background checks on private sales and loans would be hard to monitor and regulate, while having little impact on the illegal sales. There are also concerns about how well calibrated the existing background check system really is. In 2021, more than 150,000 firearm sales were blocked by the existing system, but more than 7,000 of those were blocked in error. Any denial can be appealed, but that takes time. Others say the FBI's current system fails to accurately capture all disqualifying conditions and is often not up to date.
There's also a concern that this system could someday be used to confiscate guns. However, at present, the federal government is not permitted to create a national registry for firearm owners.
Next, let's look at laws that might allow family members and law enforcement, or even romantic partners, doctors, or school officials to ask courts to remove firearms from the home of someone who they believe may be a threat to themselves or others. These laws aren't based on criminal history or mental health issues, but deal with situations where a person has indicated they're likely to harm themselves or others.
Collectively known as red flag laws, these laws have already passed in several states, including California, Florida, New York, and Illinois. The federal government provides funding for states to implement red flag laws, but there are no federal red flag laws in place. That's the subject of the second action. the passage and implementation of a federal red flag law.
Advocates of red flag laws say they have been used to reduce gun violence and save lives. Guns have been removed from the homes of people who threatened mass shootings, were known to be suicidal, or domestic abusers.
Advocates see a real potential to reduce self-harm. 10 years after Indiana enacted its red flag law, the state saw a 7.5% reduction in its firearm suicide rate, but others say that someone with the intention to commit suicide will still find a way. In Connecticut, the red flag law led to a reduction in suicide by firearms, but was offset by an increase in suicide by other means.
Supporters believe that red flag laws are actually underutilized and could do a lot more to prevent gun violence if coupled with public education campaigns explaining the law and how it is enforced.
But some say red flag laws are unconstitutional, and there's a general fear that the government could abuse the red flag process to deprive law-abiding citizens of firearms. They believe red flag laws are a violation of due process because they allow for the confiscation of firearms before an individual commits an act of violence. Some laws allow the confiscation order to be issued before the gun owner has been notified and has the opportunity to appear in court.
But supporters argue that red flag laws do not impose broad restrictions on all gun owners, and only allow a judge to temporarily remove a person's access to guns when there's evidence that they pose a serious risk.
Finally, should there be a federal ban on those semi-automatic firearms that some call assault weapons, as well as magazines over 10 rounds? Some have advocated for a revival of a 1994 law that did just that, perhaps with even broader restrictions. Congress did not renew that law in 2004, and there is currently no federal ban in place.
Those who support the ban believe it could reduce the number of deaths in mass shootings by decreasing the shooter's arm capacity and forcing them to reload more often. They argue that assault weapons are military-grade weapons that do not serve a practical purpose for individual self-protection or hunting, and any reduction in their accessibility could save lives.
But others believe it is not clear that a ban on assault weapons would have a significant impact on gun violence, seeing as mass shootings account for a small percentage of total gun-related deaths every year. They also note that such a ban is unlikely to include the many firearms already in circulation, where they are commonly chosen for self-defense, for features such as accuracy and low recoil. Magazines over 10 rounds are thought to be necessary tools for self-defense against multiple attackers, and there are those who believe any such ban would violate their right to self-defense under the Second Amendment.